Let's see what the stew has for us today.
Welcome to the Gnomecast, a Gnome Stew tabletop gaming advice podcast. Here we talk with the other gnomes about gaming things to avoid becoming part of the stew, so I guess we'd better be good. This episode is brought to you by our awesome Patreon backers like the Brisk Bill Carter, the Garrulous GM Gerrymander, and the Bracing Bob Queck. Today we have myself, Ange, along with Jared and JT, and we're going to talk about picking up new editions of familiar games. Before we dive into that main topic, though, we're going to ask our Let's Get to Know a Gnome question. And that question today is, other than D&D, what is the oldest game you've continually played? Now, to qualify, you have to have played some version of it within the last 5 years. Jared, I'm going to start with you.
Of course. So, I actually came up with two responses for this because I'm not 100% sure if these both apply. So the first thing I was talking about was Star Wars, but the problem with Star Wars is it has changed editions radically. It's not like iterations of the same edition. It went from West End Games to multiple D20 versions to then the Fantasy Flight system.
Mm-hmm.
And if you count Star Wars as a role-playing property and just kind of see it as one game that has radically changed rules, that would be my answer. However, if you, like me, also believe that's a cop-out, I would probably have to say Fate, because the very first Fate game that I got was Dresden Files, like the original Dresden Files back in 2010. And then I got, Fate, I have Fate Core, Fate Accelerated, Fate Condensed. I have multiple versions of Fate of games that have the Fate Core rules re-summarized within them. So I would probably have to say Fate, because that's been about a 10-year run.
Now here's a question. Do you count Fudge in the evolution of Fate? Which takes you back into the 90s if you ever played it back then.
I never played Fudge, so thankfully I don't have to honestly answer this question. But I'll throw my 2 cents worth in. I mean, it is definitely part of what went into Fate. I don't know if you can still say that it is... It's Fate in the same way that Forged in the Dark games are powered by the Apocalypse.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah, I was going to say it's the same as first edition D&D is related to 5th edition D&D. If you strip off all the identifying marks, they are nowhere near the same game.
Yeah.
But if you start, you can see some similarities in the same basic 6 stats, things like that. So I would say yes, Fudge is Fate, but is at least a linked predecessor to Fate.
You can trace the evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
How about you, JT? What's your answer to this one?
I'm going to go with Cyberpunk. I did look around my shelves behind me and kind of peered through the games. Top Secret SI is an older game that I've played quite a bit of, but not continuously. I have to have played some version within the last 5 years. That disqualifies Top Secret SI, even though I've still got it on the shelf. So I'm going to go with Cyberpunk, starting with the 2013 version. What was that, 89? Something like that? 90? Around there somewhere?
Yeah, I think 89 is right, but I'd have to look it up.
I'd have to look it up as well. So, but following through Cyberpunk 2020 and its glory days and on through today, and then, of course, Cyberpunk Red, which just got released last month. And I have been sparingly going through the book. It for me, Cyberpunk Red is like a good dessert that you want to slowly enjoy, as opposed to that Happy Meal that you just want to chow down and get on with your day. So I've been slowly enjoying Cyberpunk Red over the last 3 or 4 weeks or so. So what about you, Ange? What's your oldest continuously played game?
My answer is the rival to your game, Shadowrun.
Yes.
So Shadowrun was the first game I truly became aware of other than D&D. And that's because my GM had that very sexy book with the Larry Elmore cover I'm like, what is this? What is this? And then, it has been one of my convention games. I go to a convention, if there's a Shadowrun game on there, and I either trust the GM or don't know the GM, I'll give it a shot, because there's plenty of bad Shadowrun GMs I won't play with. But it's probably been the game system setting that I have played longest. The caveat to that, I will say, is I have actually never really had the opportunity to play a Shadowrun campaign. I've never had a GM
Okay.
in my life that has been willing to run a campaign. One of the guys in my group tried, but we only played like 2 sessions before life happened and we got distracted by something else. So I've never actually played a campaign of Shadowrun. If the qualifier is campaign, I'm gonna say World of Darkness, because, we played Vampire back in the early 90s when it came out, and it is still a game that pops up occasionally. We did I think it's within the 5-year time limit I set on things, but we did a holiday special World of Darkness game that was a lot of fun a few years ago, where we basically, one of us was a vampire, one of us was a werewolf, 2 people were like mundane FBI agents, one guy was a cultist, and one guy was a terrorist who was going to blow up a large party in a penthouse on New Year's Eve.
Oh, wow.
And so, we had these different people moving in different things, and it was a whole bunch of fun using World of Darkness. So that's another one that's kind of been a continuous thread, even if it's not a regular we turn back to anymore.
Right. Yeah, my Cyberpunk is similar to your Shadowrun in that I have game mastered it for, since 92, I think is when I first picked up 2020. I had 2013, but I couldn't get anybody to come to the table until 2020 came out and went from there. But anyway, I've kind of been doing a mental count here while you were talking, 7 campaigns.
Wow.
A whole bunch of one-shots. I don't even know how many one-shots, to be honest with you. And I've only played, been a player in 1 campaign. And that's because I begged and begged and begged my buddy to run it for me and another friend. And he acquiesced, and he actually ran a damn fine game. And that ran for 8 months or so.
That's respectable.
And we just had a blast. Yeah, it's respectable for Cyberpunk or any modern or futuristic game. Those tend to run shorter than your fantasy games for some reason. Go figure.
What's interesting is my Call of Cthulhu experience is like Ange's Shadowrun experience, because that is a convention game for me. I've never had anyone run it. I've never been in a campaign. It's just, I usually at least once a year at a convention pick up a Call of Cthulhu game.
Nice.
And I think that brings us, quite nicely into our main topic of discussion. I think it is safe to say that the 3 of us qualify as grognards, i.e. old gamers.
Yeah.
We all started playing decades back, so we've seen many games come and go, and many games evolve over the years with new additions, and we thought it would be an interesting conversation to talk about what makes people pick up a new edition of familiar games. Jared, you're the one that proposed this topic, so I'm going to toss this to you first.
Okay. Well, not only did I pose this topic, but I have a poll that I had run online that I had written an article on for my blog. So I actually have some data to throw at people. So I'm getting my day job involved in my night job. So what I came up with when I ran this poll, 51% of people said that they would get a game if they liked the new version, if they had the money for it. No real qualifier to it. It was just, if I want it, I'll get it. No big deal. 20% said that they like to buy new editions when it is a dramatic change from a previous edition. Like, that makes it worth it for them to buy it.
So those are the people that got pissed off when WotC did 3.0 to 3.5.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And then the funny thing is 19%, so almost the same percentage, would prefer that a new edition be tweaks and reorganizations and clarifications rather than brand new. Those are the people that loved 3.5.
Yes.
And then 9% of the people that responded basically said they would rather buy a whole new game than to keep getting new editions of a previous game that they already own. So I have a few data points on that. Personally, while I like brand new snazzy things, I do wish more games did the iterative method where it's like, well, we know X is a problem, so let's just refine how X works, but leave everything else the same. and put out a new edition. Like, I don't mind that. I know there are people that do mind that, but I kind of like how that being a where you learn from the specific things that you've seen as trouble points.
Well, let's take a second and talk about why a game company or a designer would come out with a new edition of the game. Because there's a wide variety of reasons to come out with a new edition. There is, what you were just saying, the previous version isn't organized as well as it should be, it's not as clear as it should be, and we can refine some of that. There is the rules have evolved and we can make a better game that's, fits with the more modern gaming milieu. And then there's the let's face it, there is the purely, capitalist version of we need to continue making money with this product so we can get people to buy new books if we put out a new edition. All three of those are valid reasons why new editions come out, and sometimes it can be all three.
Yeah.
Yep. My issue with the small iterative changes is buying the 500-page $60 book, and then I have to personally go through and figure out what 4 things did they change.
Yeah.
Right. I would gladly subscribe to a, I don't know, magazine type release where they're like, here are our monthly changes or our quarterly changes. Quarterly is probably more reasonable for, 15 or $20 a quarter. And then every, 4 years, here's all the changes rolled up into one. I don't know, that seems more reasonable to me. To call out Paizo and Pathfinder 2, I was not a fan, to be honest with you. They made some pretty good changes. They modernized the game quite a bit, but it wasn't a deep enough shift for me to justify ditching, because the conversion from Pathfinder 1 to Pathfinder 2 is considerable. It's not a light lift on the Game Master to convert a version 1 monster to a version 2 monster or class or prestige class or whatever. It's a heavy lift, and I was so deeply invested in Pathfinder 1, I didn't feel like lifting, the mental lift, that is, mentally lifting all my Pathfinder 1 knowledge into a Pathfinder 2 rule set. So, honestly, when they released Pathfinder 2, I moved to D&D 5.
Yeah.
The irony of what you had mentioned about not necessarily republishing books with brand new information, but just having some sort of updated centralized location. This is a good versus bad in the same instance, where 4th edition D&D, if you had the insider account, when there was errata, they would update everything. So if you were making your characters straight out of the character builder, you were up to date. But the problem was 4th edition had way too much errata for the age of the game. Like, literally weeks after it would come out, there would be whole sections that didn't look the same anymore in the books.
Well, I mean, let's face it, to a certain degree, you almost couldn't play 4th edition without the character builder.
Yeah.
Agreed.
It was really difficult to try and keep track of everything you had to update for a character without what the character builder automated for you.
Yeah.
So trying to do the errata on top of what's in the books on just straight pen and paper is part of why, there were a lot of, let's just face it, there were a lot of issues with 4th edition. There's a reason the span of time between 4th edition to 5th edition is so tiny, but that was, I think, one of them, is that I do not think 4th edition was a bad game. I enjoyed a lot of what I played in 4th edition. It wasn't an easy game. It was kind of cumbersome.
I do think that's an instance where multiple things that they wanted to do, like when you're saying that, a new edition might be triggered by multiple things. I think the desire to resell a new set of core books caused that game to come out probably a year before it should have, at least.
Yeah.
Like, I think another year of fine-tuning would have hammered out a lot of the things that kind of overwhelmed the game right at the start.
Well, I mean, let's be honest here. In 3rd edition, I think Jared and I think you and I talked about this before. In 3.0, they came out with a new hardcover book once a quarter, every 2 months.
Yep.
There were a massive amount of 3rd edition books, hardcover books for D&D.
Not counting world books, it was quarterly for hardcover and 5 softbacks per quarter as well. So some months you'd get 2 softbacks and a hardback.
Yeah,
My wallet and my bookshelves felt it all.
in the very last year of D&D development for 3.5, at least the last year before they announced they were going to 4th. So people were still kind of assuming this is going to keep going on. They literally did have months where there were 2 hardcovers per month.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be 1 core book and 1 Realms book. Then the next month it would be 1 core book and 1 Eberron book. And it got ridiculous.
Yeah.
That was part of why I never got into Eberron, is because I was trying to keep up with all of the core releases and all the Realms releases. So I just couldn't, make any room to pick up any Eberron books either.
Yeah.
Same here.
I'm looking over at my shelf. I was the one that picked up the Eberron books. They're on my shelf right over there.
So you're the one that kept it alive.
Honestly, I love the setting now. It was just that, back in the 3.5 era, it was like, oh, I've always loved the Realms, and I can't really jump off this train right now, so...
Right.
I have a very good friend who prided himself on his D&D book collection. He had every single book that TSR had, not necessarily every module, but every hardcover book that TSR had ever put out. So when WotC picked it up and came out with 3.0, he was trying to pick up. And then there's the open license, so you've got all these third-party people publishing D&D material, and he's like, do I try and keep up with that? He very quickly realized, no, you couldn't. But even the sheer volume that Wizards was coming out with for 3.0 was overwhelming for somebody whose mission it was to collect all hardcover D&D books.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a admirable mission. Tough one for the 3.035 days. Yeah.
But I think they moved, they kind of learned their lesson, between that and then the debacle that was 4th edition and then moving into 5th edition. They've been much more conservative with the number of hardcover books they come out with.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting is that as far as I left a spot for people to, throw in their own comments in that survey, and the games that got mentioned as a big paradigm shift, where the game didn't barely resembled the previous version of the game, was 7th Sea 2nd edition and 4th edition D&D. Games that people cited as being very similar to previous editions were Call of Cthulhu and Savage Worlds between different editions.
Yeah.
And, from what I've seen, I would agree with both of those assessments.
I think I would agree with those as well. I know quite a few people who were upset with the 2nd edition 7th Sea changes. In part, that's because they spent way too much on the Kickstarter without understanding what the game was going to be.
Yeah.
But that's a different story.
Yeah, because they leaned super heavily narrative in 2nd edition, and I enjoyed it. My biggest complaint about it is they needed more examples since it was so narrative.
Yeah.
But, I actually, from what I have seen, because I didn't really get the 1st edition, but from what I have seen, I like how they changed some things about the world, and I think there were probably some fans of 1st edition that would have been on board for the changes to the world that weren't on board for the shift from a medium crunchy game to one that is much lighter.
Not that I had played the first, I'd only played the 1st edition once, I think, but an issue I had with the 2nd edition was the method of gaining experience. You had to have a goal, and it was just very nebulous. Do I game this and come up with something I know I can complete in a real time, or do I come up with something truly narrative for my character that may never be completed in her lifetime?
Yeah,
so it was like,
Yeah, I ran 2 campaigns of it, and the first one went really well. The other one just kind of fizzled out. It wasn't bad or anything. But we ran into that a few times where someone would come up with their goal, and the way they phrased their goal, they literally could not advance for session after session. They could not do the next step of their...
That's horrible.
I had a situation where we made characters all from the European style area. We all set our goals, and then the campaign started with the GM stranding us in the Caribbean.
Oh no! Ouch!
So it's like any of our goals were like,
Yeah.
you know,
Out.
across the ocean.
Yeah, and you're
so
stranded.
It was like,
Oh no!
yeah, and we're stranded.
I want to have the biggest estate in Avalon. Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
That's actually opposite. So I played a game, Pendragon, role-playing game, early 90s, and the more honor you had, the higher your level was. So you had to do things to gain honor. Kind of makes sense, right? Well, if you marry somebody with higher honor than yours, say Guinevere, you get half their honor added to yours. So you could be a lowly, let's say, second level knight, which means you're not even a knight of the round table. And if you manage to marry the noble's daughter, who has high honor just by rank of her station, now all of a sudden you go from like second level to like seventh level just overnight because you got married. And when I hit that part of the rules, I handed it to my roommate buddy, also role player, and I was like, "Did I read this right?" And he looks at it and goes, "Yep, I'm not playing this game." And I was telling the story to somebody else many years later, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I remember that loophole. They fixed that in 5th edition. You must have been playing 3rd edition." So it was like, there's 5 editions of this horrific game. Sorry whoever makes Pendragon, but I'm not a fan. And actually, I just looked it up. They just released the 6th edition this year.
Yep.
This year.
Wow.
Turns out it is by Chaosium. Wow. Okay, and others, depending on what year you look at.
Yeah, I think Chaosium just brought that back home. That it was published outside of Chaosium for a while.
Right.
So let's see. I know Shadowrun is in its 6th edition.
Right.
Call of Cthulhu is 7th edition.
Sounds right.
D&D is obviously 5th edition.
Yep.
But with an asterisk, because there's all sorts of sub editions.
Sure, if you throw in Beckme and it's offshoots. Do you
count the early, like, how do you actually parse out the early editions?
Right.
Like, we're not going there. That's like a whole podcast in and of itself.
Savage Worlds is in its, I'm going to say 3rd edition. They don't number them. There was Savage World, Adventurer, or Explorers edition, and then the latest is Adventurers edition. I think that's all of them.
Yeah.
Well, so, I had a version before the Explorers edition, and there was a version before that. So I think there's
maybe there's 4. Okay, maybe there's 4 then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I must have missed one somewhere along the way then. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have 3 editions of Shadowrun on my Savage Worlds on my shelf. And there is something to be said for that style of edition. It doesn't negate your older material.
Right.
You can still pick up your older books and just with a little bit of modification run it. I've been running East Texas University using the new, Suede Adventure Edition, but all of the East Texas University material is the previous version.
Right.
So I have to do a little bit of legwork with some of the changes that were there, like the way you handle grades and stuff, which is a very ETU thing. Because you're college students, your grades are important. If you ignore them, you're going to suffer. But, there's little changes with some of the monsters and all that. But for the most part, I can just grab something from that edition and use it as is without too much of a headache.
Right, right.
Which is nice, because, you take a look at an older adventure for D&D, and there's, like, almost an entire business of people converting those for later editions.
Yep. I've been looking at the A series, A1 through 4, for 1st edition D&D, and pondering. I haven't convinced myself to do it, but I've been pondering converting it to 5th edition and modernizing it both for social sensibility and removing sexism, racism, remove all the bad stuff that should have obviously never been there to begin with, and run it for my group. But that's a lot of work. Have
you heard of Seth Skorkowski? He's a YouTuber who does a lot of... He basically has... he does a lot of reviews of older modules.
Okay.
Like both D&D, Call of Cthulhu, some Traveler stuff. And one of the things I appreciate is he will talk about an adventure. He's like, this is going to be spoilers, so if you ever expect to play it, don't watch.
Sure.
But he will call out those things and be like, Yeah, this is not, this doesn't fly in modern times, and this is a problem as far as how the adventure was designed. You know, like the entire adventure hinges on you reacting to an NPC in a particular way, and
Right.
we all know players. They don't do what you expect a lot of the time.
Right.
So,
Or you have the the thief failed to pick the lock, full stop, adventure over, and in some cases campaign over, because the rest
yeah,
of the campaign is literally on the other side of that door and beyond, and there's no other way to get through it, to it, nothing. And yeah, so that was, it's adventure design of the day, of that day.
Yeah,
Yep.
the Gygaxian tendency to put a monster immune to magic items in one room, and if you didn't explore all the rooms on the right hand side of the hallway,
Right.
you don't have a magic item. So
Yeah.
gaming.
yes.
Yes.
What's interesting is I have been looking at like the Goodman Games 5th edition rewrites of the some of the classic adventures, and the problem, like the biggest deep dive I did into any of them was the Isle of Dread, because I remember when I was a kid I loved
Oh yeah.
that adventure, and rereading that, not only is there problematic stuff in the original version, they don't get rid of it and add some more problematic stuff in the new version. Like, you can't portray native islanders as being like prone to worship cults, not because anything is influencing their minds, but just because they're just too primitive. There's like so much stuff in there that is just like, no, you got to think about this now.
Sure.
Please, if you're updating modules, take out the racism and the
Yeah.
sexism and the homophobia.
Yeah.
Please.
And that's
Please.
actually a bigger thing and an easier thing to do than updating the rule set. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's just how it is, you know?
Yeah. Well, and then there's a section. This one killed me, because there's a section and they're talking about how the player characters probably wouldn't have enough ability to do something, and if they wanted to enslave the locals to do it, that might give them enough manpower. I'm like, don't even give anyone an option for that. Don't even
Right.
bring that up.
Yep.
And that was in the original, but it didn't get removed from the fifth edition version. Like, I wouldn't mind if you reprint the original as it was, because it's a historical document,
Sure.
but don't leave it in the new version.
So another thing I think we should talk about with new editions of games is the fact that, us old timers, there are new games that we, consider new that are coming out with newer editions. For example, Urban Shadows recently kickstarted a second edition, and Urban Shadows only came out 4 years ago?
If that, yeah,
Time
4,
is meaningless
5,
now, but yeah.
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 Feels like
you know,
12,
and
but it's really been 4. Something like that.
Yeah, and
One of
actually,
my-
that was in my notes for a game to bring up about this.
Yeah, there are some of these newer games that are like the designers are looking at the rules going, I could have done better.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my very favorite Powered by the Apocalypse games to run is Monster of the Week,
Mm-hmm.
which did a very early second edition.
Yeah.
They published the game, I believe they published the original edition themselves, realized it could get improved, and basically ended up getting a deal with Evil Hat and publishing through Evil Hat their second edition, which cleaned up the game immensely and did a lot of really cool improvements, and is, in my opinion, one of the best Powered by the Apocalypse games to pick up to figure out how Powered by the Apocalypse works.
Yes.
But there's that's starting to happen with something, like games a lot of us consider new. Like even Pathfinder was new to me, and like, that's been out for 12 years now. And
I was just gonna say, we don't want to run the math on that one though, because that one tends to be longer than you realize. I was just gonna say, Monster of the Week is one of the best ones, I think, to look at to understand Powered by the Apocalypse. But yeah, that had an early second edition. Like, it wasn't out for very long before they did a revised edition. Urban Shadows is one that you mentioned. Monster Hearts 2.
Monster Hearts 2.
Like, none of these games can be older than the Apocalypse World, so obviously these are all within that window of time.
And Apocalypse World has a second edition.
Yeah. And Worldwide Wrestling, which is another Powered by the Apocalypse game that I would suggest for people that want to get in the mindset that are having a hard time maybe bouncing off some other games, that's another one that there's a second edition of Worldwide Wrestling coming out, which actually rolls in a lot of the stuff from the supplements that were put out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what happens a lot of times with more indie designers is that because they want to get a game out, once the game is complete, it comes out. But then you get some feedback on stuff that maybe you wanted to add in there that maybe won't come out every session, but is stuff that you want to address.
Yeah.
And, I think there is a little bit more flexibility on that front to put out that next edition.
Right.
A lot of indie publishers only have, they can do playtesting, but they don't have the resources that a larger company will have to do playtesting. And even the larger companies have shot themselves in the foot by not playtesting as much as they should have, i.e.
Yeah,
4th
right.
edition. And they basically took their time coming, like I believe 5th edition came out in 2014?
Yes.
Sounds right, yes.
Yeah, and basically they did playtesting for 2 years.
Yeah.
Before coming up that. An indie designer doesn't have the resources to do that level of playtesting. So they
Right.
get the game out in as best a manner as they can, but they're going to see, if you have a designer that's dedicated to doing more with that game, they're going to see things they could have done better.
I'm also going to bring up another point. Like, let's look at software for a moment, like your web browser. How often does Google Chrome update? Every couple of weeks, right? At most. Usually it's more faster than that. A lot of indie folks are focused on their digital product, and the physical is maybe a print on demand. So they don't have to invest in 10,000 copies of a particular brand, a particular version. And when that well runs dry, now we can do, the second version. Now you're working on the second version the whole time. And
that is a great point.
when you have enough of a delta, enough of a change set, you're like, okay, we'll put 2.0 on this, upload it to Drive-Thru-RPG, lower price of version 1, keep version 2 at the price of version 1, and it's a sequel essentially, right? And move forward from there. And if you really got to have the physical, then the publisher would flip the switch on Drive-Thru-RPG to enable print on demand, and the publisher's not out a dime as far as investing in 10,000 more copies of version 2.
Yeah, because a lot of times with Kickstarter, if they're doing something that's going to be the higher quality, not print on demand run, they're going to make that to the run of people that back the Kickstarter.
Right.
So they're not getting a ton of extra stuff.
Plus, usually a print run has to be of a certain number of books. So if you sold 1,024, maybe you've got to order 1,500, and then you have 400 some odd copies left to.
But it's not like
to hand out at cons or whatever. Yeah.
It's not like those horror stories we hear from the 80s and 90s where somebody did a print run of their book and there's like boxes and boxes and boxes in somebody's basement or back room or something
I
like
have
that.
a couple of boxes of my 2 fiction novels that I have purchased for selling at cons, and had 2020 been a relatively normal year, I'd have maybe 5 or 6 copies of each book instead of 40-ish some odd copies of each book. So I've got almost 100 copies of fiction that I can't do anything with. So
an interesting thing that I have noticed, Fantasy Flight did this for a lot of games, where they would put out a beta rule set, which was essentially a complete game, but it was a complete game that they wanted people to play test.
Sure. Was it like a rules light kind of thing, or just here's what we have so far?
Basically, like for the Star Wars things, it was just the bare bones setting information, but it was like most of the rules that were going into it.
Cool.
And so it was probably maybe half the size of the full rule set, because in the full rule set, they'll go into the whole thing about how there's a grand galactic empire and blah, 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 blah. But they just hit that really fast in the beta version of it. They did that for a lot of the 40K RPGs when they still had the license for that.
They hand wave. You guys know what Star Wars is.
You know what this is. Just play this. But what I was going to say about the beta thing, I noticed, like, as far as publishers go, Magpie has been doing a lot of the Ashcan editions of games that is sort of that same mindset. Like, we're going to put out this bare bones version of the game, and eventually someday we're probably going to do a Kickstarter to do a full version of this. And I kind of wonder now, because this is something they did later, I'm kind of wondering if Urban Shadows would have been that same paradigm if they had been in that mindset of doing the ash cans back then.
That's probably very true.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, Urban Shadows is a solid book.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You know, it is, even if you're not going to run Urban Shadows, I highly enjoyed reading it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the philosophy that went into what they were trying to do with the game.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I highly recommend it even for just that.
Oh yeah. But
And
second edition looks so nice so far. Like, just the layout and the art that they have shown, and in the quick start that they released, it looks so slick.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to play it, but I really want it.
I admit I have bought a few books because they were pretty. And they're on the shelf behind me on video right now, and they're probably in pristine shape because I flipped through them once and went, ooh, nice layout, nice borders, pretty artwork. I didn't even pay attention to the rules. I mean, it could be a great role-playing game. I have no idea, but it was a pretty book.
But now here's the thing I'll throw out there, and I know we don't want to widen this discussion too much because, you know, we need to bring it back in. But there is a question about editions there. The Fantasy Flight Star Wars, there's 3 core books for 3 different styles of campaign, where, as far as the rules go, 90% of the core rules in each of those things is exactly the same. And another example I have on my shelf right in front of me, my Star Trek Adventures, where I have the core book and then the Klingon book that just released. And again, all of the resolution mechanics, the core game mechanics, are the same between those two. You know, although the Klingon book has like extra details for houses and stuff like that. But I will say, compared to the Star Wars books, one thing that they did do with the Klingon book is they kind of did that iterative thing where they clarified how they explain some of the subsystems and they introduce an alternate advancement mechanic. So that is a weird case where they kind of did an iterative thing by putting out a second book that is for playing Klingons.
All right.
So
I can't actually get on board with that because you have the value add of Klingon information, right? It's not just, you know, here's the rules we changed. It's here's the rules that we've streamlined in the intervening time, plus all the goods that you're really buying the book for.
Yeah. And I, you know, I can look over on my shelf and see those 3 Fantasy Flight Star Wars books. Those are not cheap books.
No.
So I'm somewhere in the middle on whether they're a good thing or not, because I think it's a good idea that they separated them into the types of games you could be playing, but the fact that they're all mostly the same rule set, you just have different character options between them.
I think there are definite arguments that those are 3 distinct campaign types that they are presenting.
Yeah.
But I think you could also make the argument that you could have done a core book and then 3 campaign books detailing those kinds of campaigns as well.
And I mean, I got to admit, when I've played it, we've allowed people to make characters from all 3 books. You know, we had our scoundrel, we had our Jedi, we had our ex-Imperial engineer. You know, we had somebody from, you know, there was a character from each of the books in our campaign, because, you know, that's kind of what the players want. You know, you say Star Wars and you have one person who wants to play their Han Solo and another person who wants to play their space wizard. So
right, yeah.
You kind of
like the last 6 books that Fantasy Flight have put out have not been divided into one or the other. They've been cross-game books.
Sure.
So I'm wondering even there if they kind of said, you know what? We're not going to do Starships of Scoundrels and Starships of Jedi and Starships of the Rebellion. That's a little bit harder sell.
Yeah,
there.
I wonder if that was a financial call. And if it was a smart call, because I don't know how the books were, what, $60 each ish.
I think so.
So for the full set, the base core 3, that's $180.
Interesting side note: I got my 3 books because when I hit my 10-year anniversary at work, my boss bought me $100 Star Wars minis game, and he's like, I know you're a gamer, but I don't know if this is your game, so I have the receipt if you want to return it. And it basically was able to cover the cost of the 2 books I didn't have.
Nice.
I think that mindset of dividing them that way came from when they had the 40K licenses, because I know when they had the license with Games Workshop, they were required to do each game as a separate core book because they wanted it very clear that your Imperial Guardsman game is not a Space Marines game.
Right.
Back then.
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
the current one, Wrath and Glory, is just 40K and make it fit.
Yeah.
But back then, when Fantasy Flight was doing it, they, each one had to be like, this is the one about Space Marines. This is the one about the Imperial Guard.
Well, it came from the Army book mindset of the tabletop strategy game, where this book is about orcs, and this book is about Space Marines, and this book is about whatever, right?
Yeah. So I think that was kind of an extension of that process because I think they did make some money off of having the core books separated in that manner. But I don't know that there's a big a difference. Like, there were some rules drift. Like, the core rules were the same between all of those systems, but at the same time, it felt very different when you say, your Space Marines have stats that are on average like 60 points higher than your Imperial Guard. By the way, your Imperial Guard gets a friend that gets to die so that you have the feeling of your unit losing lots of people so that your PC doesn't always die.
Right.
I don't want to drag this out too long because we are starting to go a little long, but I mean, there are those games like, the dreaded, Rift's Palladium games where they come out with new game, like new books, new supplements, and those supplements change the rules. So the point that if you built a character from an older edition and somebody else built a character from a newer edition, you were completely outclassed.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a rules drift without actually addressing
they had
an edition balance issue.
They had no intention of addressing the balance issue. Kevin's, I always say his last name wrong, Kevin of Rifts has gone on record of saying life is not fair, therefore role-playing games aren't fair, deal with it.
I mean, that hit me in 4th edition because I was playing a paladin who was supposed to be a, what was the term?
Defender?
Yes, defender.
Yeah.
So that's the same role that fighters had in 4th edition. But when Martial Power came out, which was the first splat book for the fighter types, someone entered our game playing a fighter, and they defended so much better than my paladin just after that first thing came out, and I was so frustrated by that. Because, this game isn't even 4 months old, and my character feels worthless compared to something built out of this book.
That sounds like a whole other show topic.
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
So somebody jot down niche protection somewhere.
Done. I will send a note
Bob!
to
you. Somewhere, Bob, put a pin on this.
We should probably start wrapping up. Any last thoughts before we go into our outro?
The only thing that I will say is the main thing that I learned from doing this poll is that you don't have one clear reason for people to buy a new edition. Most people just want to buy a new edition when they want to buy it and it looks shiny and they have the money for it. And everyone else is kind of split evenly between I want something completely new or I want the same thing slightly polished. And that's really it.
JT, any last thoughts from you?
No, I think Jared covered everything I was going to say, to be honest with you. Ditto what Jared said.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll add is that new editions are going to happen. They're not going to go away. Games are going to get new editions. Make your own decision and decide whether or not you want to move to a new edition or not. There are still people playing first edition D&D.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. So it's it's your choice. A new edition does not erase an old edition. So this show is funded by the Gnome Stew Patreon. You too can become a Patreon backer by following the Patreon link on the Gnome Stew website to the Gnome Stew Patreon. This episode is brought to you by the Edition Rewinder. If you don't like the latest version of a game, no one is forcing you to play it. You can always be kind and rewind back to the previous edition that you love. The Edition Rewinder is brought to you by the kind folks from a blockbusting chain of stores. If you are enjoying the Gnomecast, you'll probably like many of the other Mr. and Mark shows. Here's one to check out.
Pandas Talking Games. Phil and Cinda answer your questions about RPGs from 2 different perspectives, but with a healthy dose of panda silliness.
You can find all of us at gnomestew.com, at gnomestew on Twitter, and gnomestew on Facebook. Gnomes, where else can we find you on the internet? JT, go!
You can find me at jtevans.net. Look at the top edge of every page on my website, and you find links to all my greatness there out there on social media and other places on the internet. How about you, Jared?
All right. You can find my blog at whatdoiknowjr.com. You can find me on Twitter at WhatDoIKnowJR. And if you want to listen to my actual play podcast, one of which Ange is in, you can go to where I have my podcasts listed at anchor.fm/WhatDoIKnowJR. And where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Orikes13, Orikes13. Though, as always, just a warning, Instagram is mostly pictures of my cats. So,
As it should be.
So, do you guys think we avoided the stew this week, or are we working on a new recipe?
New recipe. I mean, we went way long.
I was hoping not to get thrown in until Gnomes 2 1.5 came out.
Gnomecast is hosted by Misdirected Mark Productions, the media arm of Encoded Designs.